And good morning, everybody. I would say on the target tables, it's something which is quite new. It works incredibly well as long as people talk. There's a host on each table, but it's really, if you're there, we want to have your opinions, we want your contributions that can work very well. Before that, though, we're going to start with the last country session of the whole conference on, as George says, on Mexico. I think if you think about Mexico at the moment, obviously, finance isn't first in our thoughts. I think the victims of that dreadful earthquake come first in our thoughts and prayers at the moment, and I know everyone feels the same way about that. On that somber note, though, finance is our business, so we're going to have an overview of the Mexican economy and finance markets. To help me do that, on my left, Samuel Rivas, the CFO of Grupo Duranco. And on my right, I'm sure you remember from yesterday, Jean Perronneau, CFO of FAMACA. Thank you very much for joining us both.
Thank you.
Jean, can I start with you and just ask if you could give a little bit of an overview about what it is that you're trying to finance at the moment and how you see the financing market in Mexico?
Right. So maybe taking a step back a little bit, FAMACA has benefited tremendously from, and it was the investment thesis when we first bought the company in 2013, was riding the wave of the energy reform, which we knew was in the drawings. Since then, since the late 2013, beginning of 2014, we've been participating in public tenders to acquire concessions from CFE, the national utility, to build and transport and operate natural gas pipelines. So we built a private pipeline in the U.S. linking, Waha to the border in El Paso, and then from El Paso down to Chihuahua, Aguascalientes, Guadalajara, and Villa de Reyes on the other side. So we're pretty much now in the center of Mexico. We're in the process of building. We're finishing one pipeline in the coming weeks that will give us access to La Laguna, which is in the state of Durango, or past the state of Durango. And then for those who don't locate that very well, it's about 1,000 kilometers south of El Paso, straight down in the middle of the country. And then we are in the process of completing the construction of two other pipelines, another 1,000 kilometer of pipeline to get to the center of the country. I mean, those pipelines are, as I mentioned yesterday, large diameter pipes, so 48 inches. We made the math. I think we could build 2,500 Eiffel Tower with the steel of this thing. So it's quite a lot of Eiffel Towers. And therefore, most of the financing for those is coming from a mix of international banks, local banks, and development banks. And I think everybody's playing a different role. So development banks are mainly financing us on the VIII and the short-term, Mexican-funded necessities of the project. And then we have international banks that are more funding long-term need in dollar. All our contracts are in dollars, so it facilitates the access to international markets. So to give you a range we are in the process of refinancing one pipeline, so $820 million financing, and then the last two pipelines we financed was $1.1 billion. So fairly large infrastructure assets.
Mm-hmm. And entirely bank market to date?
No, we have a mix. We have so the first pipeline we built and refinanced with a 144A that we issued in 2014, 24-year paper. Investment grade rated. And then we are in the process of refinancing another pipe, which will be a mix of bank financing and private placement, which we talked yesterday about alternative source of funds, with newcomers such as insurance companies and private debt funds. And then the other two pipelines which are under construction are 100% bank finance, with tenor ranging between 7 and 10 years for the commercial bank tranches.
Great. Thank you very much. Samuel, can I ask you to give a similar sort of overview of your investment portfolio?
Sure. We are Durango. We're the parent company of Blue Marine. I don't know if you have heard of it. We do pipelines, but in the ocean, so we don't compete directly with John. We do shipping and we do oil and gas. We have been seeing quite interesting projects right now due to the fact that, for one thing, the price of the oil has been quite volatile, and the companies in Mexico, some of them are suffering. Some of the, well, in top of that, Pemex has been reshaping itself, reinventing itself. So it has been, and on top of that, the energy reforms have been bringing some more players. So we have been seeing interesting projects, not only in our sector, but in other sectors. Speaking about the funding, we work very close with international banks. And we have been working with the developed banks in Mexico, like Bancomex and Afinsa. They're starting to put money on the sector.
Great, thank you very much. Can I just start things with just thinking about the macroeconomics? I mean, Mexico has a, dare I say it, a little bit of reputation of being a little bit dull macroeconomically. It's steady, slow growth, not much volatility. Is that going to continue? Is that a deserved reputation?
Yeah, I believe, first of all, since 50 years ago, Mexico has been in a good shape, financial speaking, in regards of interest rates, in regards of inflation. Interest rates like at 6%. For us, it's a good number. Inflation very controlled at 5%, and the change rate. The peso has been stable. The peso, I don't know if you guys remember, but 20 years ago, it has banned. So it was like artificial. Right now, the peso has been it's the second most traded currency in emerging markets after the yuan, and the 11th in the world. So it trades 24 hours a day. I mean, it's a proxy from Latin America. So for the financial, the healthy of Mexico, financial health of Mexico is good. What we lack, as you said, is the growth. We don't grow due to the fact that there's some lack of help of maybe the government, and then we have been growing like a 2.5% across the board. But as we mentioned earlier, there's growing at 2% in the middle, and then at 5% and at 0% in some states. So it has been very, very volatile. So in a nutshell, I could say that Mexico is in a healthy position financially, but it's not a growing, an emerging country that would attract many investors.
And that distribution of growth within the country is because some states are export-led?
Yes. We were talking about las manufacturas, maquiladoras in the north of Mexico. They have been growing a lot. Auto industry has been growing a lot. Other sectors are very slow.
Okay. And that slow growth rate, Jean, you mentioned about riding the wave of reform, I think you put it. Can you tell us a bit about those reforms, and do you think that they're going to help this sluggish growth?
Well, I also would like to prevent us thinking too much about averages, because I think it's easy to say that Mexico has an average growth that is low. I agree, that's what it is. But I think if you look more finely at states and a sector, you'll see a very big disparity. I think the election of Mr. Trump has had some consequences in the FDI in Mexico, and a lot of automotive companies actually withheld their investment decision, especially in the Bajío region, which is in the center of the country, where historically a lot of spare parts and big plants are located. And there have been big announcements of people reinvesting in the US and Canada, which will probably not happen because it takes between 7 and 10 years to build one of those plants anyway. So, but that being said, that has slowed down a little bit the investment and the growth in those sectors, which were definitely the one that were pulling the whole country to this 2.5%, which is sort of low, but there's also, I think, quite a lot of sectors that are not growing at all. And I think a way to help that is the inflow of private capital, not necessarily just in the big blue chip company, but also in the SME, and I think a lot of the things that we're seeing are symptomatic of a lack of education and a lack of development of the SME sector. We're talking about banks and funding, same thing, banks and funding, it's easy to lend to a blue chip company that is rated, that's called, Cemex, that's called Bimbo, that's called Alpha. I would encourage us, in my former life when I was also in private equity, is just look at the next company, the next guys who have a good idea, who need funding, who need support. That's how we'll pull the country up. So the energy reform I mentioned is not the only one that the government had started. They started the labor reform, tax reform, and education reform. That's a lot of reforms. And I think, it's also very easy we were discussing that with Samuel. He was saying, the energy reform is slow. I was just putting things in perspective. It took 8 years for the UK to do the same thing in that gas sector in the 90s. It took 20 years for the US to get to a liberalized market in energy, and it's still not there. So I think when people are saying that Mexico is slow, I think, they are doing a great job. And I think I have a lot of compassion for the politicians and the lawmakers who are drafting all these laws, because it's all new. They for 50 years, they were in the hands of a national monopoly. And we're going to see, and we are starting to see, a few years after the announcement and the first secondary law were passed in 2014, you have, for the first time, you have international company, oil majors investing in Mexico. You have a round of auctions with, international organizations looking at, themes around, corruption and openness of the auction system. I think it's a lot of very positive development, and I think that will bring confidence to form more investments from private equity fund or institutional investors to put more money into Mexico. So I'm very actually hopeful for the country that it's the right thing to do. And I think we are seeing some development in the energy sector. Hopefully we'll see some more development in the industrial sector as well. But that, as one of the topics we might discuss, is also linked to the situation with the biggest neighbor, the US, and NAFTA negotiation. And so it's not that simple, and it will be up and down. But I think directionally, I think the country is going in the right direction.
Okay, that's a nice positive note. Samuel, I guess 2 questions. Firstly, do you agree? Are you optimistic about the reform program? And then we had to get there. I think we went 8 minutes before we mentioned Trump, but we have to go there. So second question, this private investment and the NAFTA situation, is that going to stymie the flow of private funds? Sorry, the reforms first.
First, I agree.
Okay,
John.
that's easy.
Not completely agree, but we have been waiting this reform for years, so it comes, and we don't see any big changes. But I understand what John is saying now. So I completely agree. With NAFTA, from my point of view, it has been giving us a lot of volatility due to this renegotiation. But we have been talking with the people who is negotiating this deal, and it has been, for good, it has been slow. So from my point of view, I don't believe, and I'm risking myself, I don't think that there are going to be a lot of big changes. So what I mean is that changing the NAFTA backwards or all the way around 180 degrees, it will be very difficult in 4 years. And maybe 3.5 years now, counting. Maybe another president would do different things.
Well, we don't have 4 years. We've got the midterm elections coming up. I think one of the speakers yesterday said that you need to deliver something that Trump can deliver as progress. Otherwise, it's another, like the wall, it's
Sure.
another one of those rhetoric things that just didn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong, there's going to be progress, but not. I don't believe that it will have a very big impact in the economy of Mexico. They're going to have of course, volatility, but I don't see it like a big impact on changing big economic trends or numbers.
Okay, Jean, do you agree? Is it?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's going to be a lot of announcements, and I think announcements always create fears, and that, at the board level of company who make decisions, they probably will slow down their decision-making process. But I completely agree that I don't think on the fundamental side, a lot of things will change, because the countries are, and then from Canada and to Mexico are really, really integrated. And the NAFTA is a big part of that, and I think a big success. And I think, again, if you take a look at the average, you might want to say, oh, the US is getting a bad deal. Actually, when you start digging into the details, you realize actually it's not such a bad deal for anyone. So yes, he will have to make some announcement. They will find a couple of things that they will change and make a big fuss out of it. But at the end of the day, globally, I don't think it's gonna have any major shift around the way goods and finance is treated.
In conversations with your US banks, do they bring that up? Is it a concern?
To be honest, it was last year more than this year. So last year when we went and looked for money to finance our new pipes, a lot of people were concerned, and we had a lot of explanation to do to credit committees about how the Trump administration building a wall. First of all, are they going to build a wall over, under, with a pipeline going under the border with that?
You asked for a pipeline, right?
We had a lot of questions around that, and we had a lot of questions around what happens if there's an embargo of export of gas. So I think at the end of the day, the economic rationale prevails, and that's good. But yes, people have asked questions, and I think the lack of clarity of the U.S. government on this topic, and the announcement and the little bit of drama around the White House is not helping to take long-term decisions. We're looking at, just like financing assets over the next 25 to 50 years, where volatility will happen along the way. As long as the direction is right, we'll be okay. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've been quite optimistic about NAFTA. We've been quite optimistic about the reforms. One of the real things was the Peso volatility that we saw immediately on Trump's election and then retracing. Is that a problem for you as a dollar-based company in the Peso economy?
For us, it is a problem, but only to the extent that the Mexican tax code is quite specific, is quite strange, and you have to pay taxes on unrealized gain or loss of foreign currency. And since everything is in dollars, every time the peso goes down, we make fake gains, and every time it goes up, we make fake losses. So it's quite strange, but that's quite specific. Apart from that, it hasn't been such a big issue, except that it's, as Samer said, an indicator of the sentiment around emerging markets for the rest of the world. So it works as a proxy. So each time there's an announcement, the peso jitters, but it doesn't really mean that over the long term, it's recovered from, it went down 40% and went back up, and now we're back to where we were in 2014. So I think overall it's all right.
And that proxy is simply, it's the easiest way to take a view on an emerging market currency.
Yes, that's right. It's the most rated one, the most liquid one, and therefore that's the one that's used by everybody to balance their FX portfolio.
The perils of being the liquid one.
Yeah, that's correct.
Would you agree? Do you think we're going to have a period of more stable peso rate?
If you see the volatility of the peso last few years, it has been like 10%. So it's just above the hard currency. I mean, it has been very stable, and what it shocks the peso is not the Mexican issues. It's like the Latin American issues, because in Brazil it's very hard to go in and go out. So the big asset managers goes out and catch it with the peso. So the good thing is that we have a good price in the peso. We have been increasing the volatility, but I don't think that's a main issue for us. Due to the fact we have all our income in dollars, our funding is in dollars, so it's not. John was saying it's the tax thing, but a reporting thing, but it's not an issue for us.
Okay. Let's move on from the macroeconomic topic, and we'll have an opportunity to ask some questions about that later. But Jean, you also mentioned about the SMEs, the struggle that they have, and I think it's sort of broader topic of the structure of the banking industry. Obviously, it's very foreign owned. There's very, very few domestically owned banks. Is the banking system fit for purpose?
In our sector, for example, I think Samuel would say the same thing. When you need specialists, it usually comes from the hub that those big international banks have all over the world. So you need oil and gas specialists, can be in Houston or in New York. You need some project finance guy, they're going to be in London or in Germany, as the case may be. So you're looking at I would say, a fairly broad and generalist services in Mexico, and then especially serving the special needs of the client from abroad. I think that hopefully will change, and then expertise will be built in the countries themselves, because that will be the good sign that actually there's enough volume to justify having local teams, looking at specific sectors. I think as mentioned before, it's a question of time. We need to gain momentum, have enough volume so that banks can justify putting their teams there. But I think it would be very helpful, in the oil and gas industry, in the energy industry, in the automotive industry, in all those industries that require really some specific knowledge, to have specialists in the country that have credibility outside in the credit committees, and then they start growing their volumes of the businesses like this. I think that would be quite helpful.
Okay, I can see that for the technical specialists, the sector specialists. But I'm thinking more about the overall lending behaviour of the bank. Is it beholden to capital rules in coming out of Washington or out of Brussels?
I would say for most of them it is, yeah. And I think banks who have access to local funding and retail operation can obviously fund in peso even long term now, which is a great development. But I think that remains a small minority, I would say. So if you're an SME, I think it's also pretty difficult to make yourself a name. I think Fermaca certainly was an SME. It still is a big SME today, but I think, having the backing of an international sponsor has helped a lot the company. Not everybody can do that. So I wonder how smaller clients are treated, even if they have interesting product, interesting ideas. I just don't know. But it seems to me that the support they're getting is not that much, because talking to other entrepreneurs, they seem to be struggling getting access to corporate funding.
So, do you agree?
Completely agree. Remember, we don't have international banks in Mexico. The four big players are international banks, but local banks. So Banamex, Citibank bought Banamex, Scotia bought Inverlat, BBVA bought Bancomer, and Santander bought Banco Mexicano. So there's international banks now. There are local banks with all their portfolios, but what is lacking is like very specialized sectors to be in the country. In order for us to go to fund, we have to go to New York, to London, to Spain. So
to Jean's point about the
I totally
sector specialists.
Yes, a sector specialist in order to. We believe we know that the sector is not having the best of time, so that's why, and in Mexico, in Pemex, so the banks are like shutting a little bit down the keys. So we have to go to the sort. But if you have more technical and specialized people in the country, will be helpful. Not for our size. I mean, if you go to see Cemex, Pemex, Cemex, Bimbo, Kimberly, or that 30 big companies that are in La Bolsa, I mean, they don't have any trouble to do that. But for specialized sectors and middle companies, that's tough.
And what about the point, the liquidity point of being beholden to, if Spain or the US has, or Canada has a liquidity problem, it's outside your control, but it reduces the ability of the local banks? Is that a concern?
Sure. It has been a concern these years. And one thing that we didn't mention, I think is very important, it concerns me more than NAFTA, than Mr. Trump, than anything else. It's we have a big election next year, so that's a big issue for us. I mean, it's not a big issue, but it's gonna have a lot of volatility on the market, and maybe will shut the liquidity a little bit next year.
Right. What's the kind of the outlook on that? When is the election, first of all? Basic question, and then what's the sort of situation and the expectation?
It's in July. Mm-hmm. You have a big player that is López Obrador. He's a leftist, well, more than a leftist, he's like and we have all these parties on the other side. So López Obrador is not people like Maduro, but it's a hard guy who's going to try to put down the establishment, if you want to say that. So it's going to have a lot of volatility. At the end, I don't know. I believe he will go to the center, but at the meantime, we're going to, as Jenny was mentioned yesterday, we have a window of opportunity this coming 6 months or 8 months, and then I think the liquidity is going to shoot up a little bit.
And then if he does win, is that something that international investors are starting to worry about?
Sure.
It's a question for both of you.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, they worry about it, but they don't really know what to expect. So, I think
It's
Should they
uncertain.
worry?
I think.
Should the question.
Well, I don't know, honestly. I do not. I think it's not clear exactly what he wants to do. As always, there's a lot of announcement, but at the end of the day, there's only that much. I mean, Mexico is still a functioning democracy, and hopefully there are check and balances, and I think people are more concerned and waiting to hear what the actual program on the other side is going to be, who's going to be the opponent, and that as things get closer to the election, I mean, I think a lot of investors got it really wrong in the U.S. So
many other countries.
Yeah. So I think they're gonna, on this one, they're gonna be more cautious and wait for, even once the election has passed, wait for the program to be out, to be coming back in the country if they like what they hear or not. I think 2018 from end of Q1 is going to slow down quite a bit in Mexico, from a financing perspective, that is, an investment perspective.
Okay. We spoke briefly about the banking sector. Be remiss not to mention the pension funds, the enormous pension fund sector. Why so large, and how do you characterize its behavior, and
I think the country is a very young country, so you have a lot of people contributing to pension funds, and that's why they're growing so fast. I mean, right now they're still representing roughly, what you said, $150 billion?
150 billion.
Yeah, so which is a very decent number. But the good thing about them is they are growing quite fast, and they need to put money out of the door. So they had a lot of constraint about where they could invest, where they could not invest. They had to put those SECADE in place, and then they listed company, they can't invest outside of Mexico. So I think a lot of the rules as well are being rewritten to give them a bit more flexibility. But same thing, we're talking about, just like in banking, I think they don't necessarily have the specialists to invest this money. So I mean, that's my personal experience, visiting the SECADEs, and even the biggest one, they will have like 3 guys looking at investing in private equity. I mean, how do you do that? So they give to many managers, and it's a game of diversification and allocation more than a targeted strategy, I would say. So the SECADE are great funding and growth potential for the Mexican economy, but I think they need to jack up a little, I would say, their investment team and think a bit better, because right now there were so many boundaries and things they could not do that it was easy to invest the money. I think now, as they are giving more option, you want to make sure that they don't just end up like wasting the money of all the pensioners. So I think there's also quite a lot of talking about reforms, but that's an internal reform of how they organize and how they're thinking about allocating the money.
When you say the boundaries on what they could do, you mean in terms of
investments? Yeah. They could only do, for example, if I'm correctly, listed companies, or they could invest only through those SECADEs, which are heavily administered, funds with, like, I would characterize them as complicated structure that don't necessarily bring a lot of security or safety to the investors. It's quite bureaucratic, so that's why I'm referring to when I say they had limitations. So these limitations are being worked on. And
this is another one of these reforms.
Yeah, but as you work on this, you want to make sure actually that on the other side you have the people and institution following, because you don't want to have an open checkbook and nobody to administer the money. So I think be careful there.
Completely agree. In my other life, I was the risk manager of Banamex, of asset management. So when this afford start to grow several years ago, they put a lot of regulation in order to protect the workers, because it's public money. and it was mentioned, now it's $150 billion and it's growing in a double digit. So what they do is they give a square regulation. So the forest couldn't invest in hedge funds, in private funds, in anything like that. So they like invent this new instrument called Secades. I don't know if you are familiar with it, but through the Secades you can invest in the Afore can invest in this kind of asset projects or special purpose projects. And the Secades right now they are $15 billion, so it's been growing a lot. It's a good vehicle to start to get funds. So yeah, it's a good buckle to get into a good bucket.
And a lot of their investment is index linked or with nominal rates?
Net link, almost all of it. And it was mentioned at the beginning the expertise of these investment guys in the forest was looking at the government curve or some equities. Right now they have been growing in order to see this our kind of projects, pipelines or trees or many projects that the country put in the table. So I think in a few years the Secades and the Afores will be the primary source of funding for us.
Okay. And for you also, given the long-dated nature of their...
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we did some fundraising with the Secades, but I think back in the days, that was in 2014, I don't think they had the people. So we saw three guys that had no idea what we were doing, no idea about the sector. I mean, it wasn't their fault, right? They have to manage, as you say, $15 billion. I mean, imagine you have three of you, and you make investment check of $50 million each. I mean, that's quite a few checks, you know. So it's impossible to be a specialist, and we were talking about really specialized private investment in a private company in Mexico in a sector that didn't exist 10 years ago. So it's I think for them to be able to allocate the money, they need to grow their internal resources. Otherwise, we're going to end up with very big checks in the hands of the bless them, the BlackRock and the Blackstone and big brands. So at least nobody gets fired for giving money to Blackstone or BlackRock, Mm-hmm. But if you do your own direct investment in a private company in Mexico, which is, in my mind, where that should go, then you put your head on the table, So I think people think about it twice. So the Secade money at some point will find its way to growing the SMEs and stuff. For now, it's finding its way going into more branded and packaged products just because they don't have the resources to allocate properly their fund, I think.
Okay. And more passive investing rather than active?
Yeah.
Index
Yes.
tracking
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that pension funds should put everything in private equity, but I think 10% seems like it's actually a fairly high number. I think considering the number of opportunities there are in Mexico, I think it's quite a lot. But the vast majority should remain in more liquid. I mean, liquidity is a bit of a fake, I would say, fake news, because when the market go down, you can be in a liquid market. If you're going to sell, you're going to lose your shirt anyway. So you might as well be in an illiquid one and just sit tight and wait for the cycle to come back rather than just panicking like people do sometimes. So anyway. In terms of allocation, I think it's a lot of pension funds, especially in the north of Europe, have done that very well for a very long time. Diversification and looking at different products and bringing specialists in-house are going to be key for those guys to do the right thing.
Okay.
No, completely agree.
Completely agree. Okay. Another aspect of the investor side that I just wanted to touch on, following on from a very interesting panel yesterday, was about the green investors and the growth of a very dedicated pool of asset managers who have signed up to these principles. Is that a significant development? Do you think that it has potential?
Of course, Jan can talk more than me in that field, but what we have seen is that the development banks like Bancomext and Afins are putting money in there. And again, well, if you do a project of CFE or CFE, is not that difficult to get funding. And the big companies like Bimbo, Cemex, Mexico, which needs energy, they are funding itself, and they are not having problems with it. They are projects like $100 to $500 million, but the companies that are not in that tier, they are having problems in funding, but it's growing, and we have been speaking with Bancomext, for instance, and they have been very, very thoughtful in going into the market, helping not only the big companies, but also the smaller companies in very direct projects and renewables in green projects.
Yeah, green investment for us. I mean, it's been a topic, and a lot of thankfully the gas out of the fossil fuel is probably the least polluting source of energy and necessarily evil at the time. But I think it's an interesting development. But again, I think we are. I worked in a private equity fund before that was dedicated to renewable energy in Europe, so I can tell you that there's a lot of people want to do a lot in this sector, but same thing, the lack of capabilities, and I think, the learning curve has been very, very steep, especially in Europe after the Spanish change of regulation, the Italian one, the French one, the German one, you name it. So I think people want to dedicate money into this sector as well, have to bring specialists. I think we're going back to the same point of it makes a lot of sense. It just needs to be done right and with the right people, and not just have those great ideas that are great on paper, but then when it comes to execution time, that's when the clock starts ticking, and you need to make lend the money or invest in the right companies, back the right management teams, execution, and then you have the operation of the assets. So it's a whole life cycle. It's not just the fundraising. It's also what comes after. That is I would say the hard work, where the hard work comes. So the green investing makes a lot of sense, especially in Mexico that has a lot of wind and a lot of sun and a lot of geothermal resources. But I think the value chain needs to mature still quite a lot. I think there's still a lot of parrots in the industry, especially on the developer side. So I think it's not an easy sector to invest in for sure. So if you want to develop that in Mexico, I think you need to bring the right people and just be very selective about who you go with, because the learning curve, you're going to have a lot of trial and error, because it's local.
Yeah, lack of expertise is quite a common theme I'm hearing quite a lot.
Yeah, and I think same thing, lack of expertise. Why? Because everything is new. So I think that's where Mexico is a real emerging market, not necessarily by the growth it demonstrates, but by the fact that there's a lot of new things, especially in the energy space, that didn't exist 5 years ago, 3 years ago. So you're going to see private initiatives on the up to now, as Samuel was saying, CFE was buying all the power, and now you're creating a proper power market where people can trade spot, where you're going to have private off-takers. So you need to bring on the bank side, on the investor side, people who know how to deal with that and know how to just not look at the public rating of CFE and say, okay, good, we can lend 20 years on that, but go into, okay, who is this off-taker? Why does he need this power? What happens if the PP is out of the money? What happens if it's in the money? All these things that, have been done in Europe, in the US for a while, and are completely new to the sector. And that's just for green investments. The same for energy, the same for, I would say, telecom, where we're going to see also some very interesting development. There's a pseudo monopoly of telecom as well in Mexico. So,
which is in the process of being reformed as well?
Yeah, it's been reformed already. So you have, now open access and people other than Telmex coming into the market, but people are struggling to find the funding, are struggling to find, unless they are the big guys from Europe or the US coming in, local company that want to develop tower, optic, fiber optic, all these sort of services. I can tell you, because I have a friend who's doing that, is struggling to find the backing. Not on the equity side, actually, but on the banking side, for sure. So he's looking for funding in France.
Yes. Yes, because some of the technology is from Europe, so they will find the financing there. And I completely agree. I think there's some pressure from to the government to go green. So the development bank like Nafinsa, Bancomex are putting maybe not the expertise, but the money, the funding start to flowing down. So if you guys have a green project, go to Bancomex or to Nafinsa. They will open. I believe they will open the doors.
I could use this as an advert for the target table on securitizations. It's an obvious way of channeling
Yep.
that kind of asset which can't be financed in other ways, but I won't do that. We only have a couple of minutes left. We touched on a lot of topics on the macroeconomics, on NAFTA, and then on financing. Do we have any questions or any comments from anyone in the audience?
It's Friday morning.
It's too early.
It's Friday morning.
Can't believe everyone's so shy. No comments? Okay, well in that case, thank you very much to my panels.
Thank you.
And please join me. And then hopefully everybody has now registered, but the target tables lined out in front of you. So the LSTA's Latin American initiative on this table here, investing in green energy on the B table, this one here, Latin American commodity finance on C table, and then securitization by the door. So please join us. Thank you.